I was quite astonished to know what it was because it had no propeller.
And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." There was the awful race against time. There was the skullduggery.
She used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush."
I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
A small English church is the last resting place of a man who didn't just change the face of the earth. He enabled us to see what it actually looked like. His name was Frank Whittle. This is the story of how he invented the jet engine. He overcame all the odds, only to see the British government almost throw his idea away and miss a chance to shorten the Second World War.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. And I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small, engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that. I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly.
The teenage Whittle therefore applied to join the Royal Air Force as an apprentice, only to be rejected. He was too small.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, Max Alding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though it never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time, and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
Whittle didn't enjoy life as an RAF apprentice. In that rank, he would never get to fly. What brightened Whittle's life was the Model Aircraft Society, where he excelled at building working replicas. His talent for this singled him out to the authorities. But there was in fact another reason why his commanding officer thought Whittle might be officer material.
He thought that he'd got a mathematical genius.
It was this natural gift that got Whittle a cadetship. Less than 1% of apprentices made the huge step to join the elite in the Officers' Training College at Cranwell. Although this was next to the apprentices' wing, it was socially another world, one that shared the culture of the public schools from where most of the cadets then came. Cranwell provided a very intensive education for Whittle. For the cadets, just as it is today, the highlight of the course was the flying lessons.
I learned to fly on the Avro 504K. That was a very ancient type of aeroplane, 1911 type, and it sort with a toothpick between the wheels, you know, to prevent it tipping over on its nose, which in reality it helps it to tip it over on its nose, or even turn upside down.
Whittle was soon a daring, even overconfident pilot, and one who had his fair share of accidents.
I have to confess that I wrecked 2 or 3 aeroplanes. 3 at least, yes. The first one, I got lost and wanted to get back to Cranwell when the visibility had deteriorated very badly. It was the day, incidentally, of the cross-country run at Cranwell, which all cadets hated. And most of my fellow cadets thought I'd done it to get out of the cross-country run.
In between learning to fly and studying at Cranwell, Whittle first conceived the idea that would make him famous. It all started with a student thesis.
All cadets had to write a thesis, and I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side. But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency, and so forth. And to me, that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant.
Whittle envisaged flying speeds of 500 miles an hour, at a time when propeller planes struggled to reach 150. These machines were noisy and shook the pilot terribly. That's because their engines were actually car motors on a bigger scale with many moving parts. Whittle felt an aesthetic dislike for such power plants.
The problem with the piston engine as you go up height, even though you supercharge it, is that the power drops off as the air gets thinner, and there eventually comes a point where it won't generate enough power to turn itself over against its own friction.
Whittle's idea would use the same principle as a balloon filled with air. When this escapes, every child knows what happens. But it wasn't clear how an engine might recreate such a force.
I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, and then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan, and substitute a turbine for the piston engine? And there was the turbojet.
By now, Whittle had left Cranwell, but his search for this solution had preoccupied him ever since.
It didn't come to me out of the blue for the simple reason that I've been trying to find it for 18 months. But just the thought, get rid of the piston engine and substitute a turbine, you might say that came out of the blue. Whether I was having a bath or whatever at the time, I couldn't tell you.
Whittle's plan proposed just one moving part. This would be a shaft with a compressor, driven by a turbine at the other end. It would work like this. The compressor spins round, sucking air into combustion chambers at many times atmospheric pressure. Here, this air is mixed with vaporized fuel and ignited. The hot gas created expands through the turbine, turning the shaft, and escapes into the atmosphere. It is this continuous force which propels a jet aeroplane along.
After the idea had come to me, I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
This was Whittle's moment of genius. He had seen the future of powered flight, and he was a pilot officer, aged just 22.
I was at the Central Flying School at Wittering doing the flying instructor's course. One of the instructors there was W.E.P. Johnson, who became a very good friend and colleague in later years, and he'd been trained as a patent agent. And he became very interested in my proposal. He thought it would work, and he helped me to draft a patent.
Have you ever patented anything? No, I don't know a thing about it. Does a patent both publish and protect? That is the whole point of patents. But one thing's essential. File a patent application before touting the thing round, otherwise you haven't a hope. I'll tell you what, let's rough out a specification now. Fine, what do we do? Well, you make a rather better sketch and I'll get on with the clever bit, the writing. Okay.
Armed with his patent, Whittle offered his idea to industry. No one thought it could ever work.
According to the theories of the time, there was this fundamental difficulty with gas turbines, inefficient compressors, inefficient turbines, and the other big snag was the materials then existing in 1929 wouldn't stand temperatures of more than, say, about 500 degrees centigrade. But I knew, or felt pretty confident, that they would evolve in the normal course of development, and of course they did.
The positive young officer also went to London to to put his revolutionary concept to the Air Ministry. Whittle fared no better when he met A. Griffith, one of the ministry's top scientists.
I went to see Dr. Griffith and another scientist at South Kensington, explain the idea. It was very coolly received. Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested, and so forth.
Frank Whittle had invented a new form of flight, only to see it abruptly rejected by British industry and the government. Despite this twin blow, he pursued his service career and developed his exceptional flying ability. He was now one of the RAF's best pilots and was chosen to fly in the Hendon Air Pageants, where he thrilled spectators with his skills at crazy flying. These were the red arrows of the day, and Whittle loved entertaining the public this way. At this time in Germany, a young scientist was eagerly looking forward to his first trip in an aeroplane. His name was Hans von Ohain.
I always dreamed about the beauty of flying. My first flight with a commercial airplane, I believe it was a 3-engine Yonkers, was a great disappointment. It was so noisy and so vibratory that I felt the piston engine and propeller is not the good propulsion system. The elegance of flying is destroyed by it.
The sight of smoke rushing from chimneys inspired von Ohain to think, if that force could be created by a turbine, maybe he could make a smoother aeroengine.
High speed was not the primary goal. To me, the smoothness and low noise was more the starting point of my thinking. But as I thought about it, I noticed that, as a matter of fact, it will be capable of driving the airplane faster.
The government had declined to keep Whittle's patents a secret. They soon made their way to Nazi Germany, where they were widely read in aviation circles. However, they aroused no such interest in Great Britain, and Whittle's own jet engine remained stillborn. Without a degree, he had lacked credibility as an inventor. In 1934, the Air Force enabled Whittle to solve this problem when it decided to send him to Cambridge University. Here, he applied every piece of learning to his ideas for jet propulsion.
I had got the feeling, rather, that I might be ahead of my time. With the extra knowledge I gained at Cambridge, I did become rather more aware of the difficulties.
Then this letter arrived in the post, which says, "My dear Whittle, this is just a hurried note to tell you that I have just met a man who is a bit of a big noise in an engineering concern, and to whom I mentioned your invention of an aeroplane sans propeller, as it were, and who is very interested." And he's jotted a note at the top of the original letter. He says, "This letter changed the course of my life and triggered a revolution in aviation." And it did, because this letter rescued the turbojet idea in this country from oblivion.
The writer was Rolf Dudley Williams, an old friend from Cranwell. He visited Whittle at Cambridge with another former officer named Collingwood Tinling.
And they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it. And they succeeded. They managed to find a firm of investment bankers called O.T. Falcon Partners. And in March 1936, they formed the company called Power Jets Limited. I very much wanted first-class honours, so I had to work like hell because I was designing the jet engine and preparing for my finals at the same time. And that was a very difficult thing to do. I succeeded in getting my first, happily, and then was able to turn back to the jet engine.
Whittle approached a manufacturer in Rugby to build the world's first jet engine. British Thomson Houston made steam turbines. Whittle visited the huge company aware that he had just £2,000 with which to tempt them. He drove over from Cambridge, rehearsing what he'd say to persuade them to accept a contract. His trip was a success.
B.28 built the engine, and I stood over it more or less while it was going on. I felt that the turbine was going to be all right, but I was uneasy about the combustion problem because we were aiming at 24 times the kind of combustion intensity that was obtainable in those days. But the engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. What did happen proved the very opposite. I gave a signal with my hands to raise the speed with the electric motor to 2,000 RPM, and that was done. And then I opened the main control, and it started it all right. It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. They all went down the factory like the wind. I didn't, because I was petrified with fright. I just couldn't move. It seemed like perpetual motion, but of course it wasn't. The fact was that a pool of fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber, which we didn't know about, and that was keeping it running after I'd switched off the control. Well, that sort of thing happened day after day. We had about 4 of that kind of runaway. Just after the engine first ran and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth.
Whittle didn't know that in Germany some people were by now far more willing to bet on his idea. One of them was Ernst Heinkel, a legend in his country's resurgent aviation industry. Von Ohain had been introduced to him.
He was alone in his villa in Warnemünde. He explained to me that he wanted to finance the whole thing by himself if it works. And he said, I have the best aerodynamicists, I have the best and best designers, and I want you to tomorrow to speak with them and explain your ideas. I love the Baltic Sea coast very much. I sure would think that would be a nice place to work, and so I choose Heinkel.
Heinkel's company was attractive for another reason.
The whole development was very inexpensive, but when we would have asked for more money, we would have gotten it. So money was not a problem.
By contrast, the power jet's kitty was empty. As the Nazi threat grew, Whittle had a war winner, yet Britain was set to abandon it.
There were several things which hampered progress. In 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere. But of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. The Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. After he'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract.
The ministry's grudging help only created new problems.
As soon as they gave us a contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act. That meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, look, we've got a damn good idea, would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is, but it's very good. No, we couldn't do it.
By now, Britain had spent just £7,000 on Whittle's jet. On his last day at Power Jets, he had a visitor.
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry in that Pai, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too. This, of course, was the big turning point in the whole job.
Unaware of Whittle's breakthrough, Germany already had a jet plane.
I was very certain that it would work. But, of course, you always feel there's a danger. And we had made not too many pre-tests. We ran the engine before it flew perhaps several hours at the very most.
The support of a huge aircraft company had enabled Hans von Ohain to overtake Whittle. Heinkel's HE-178 was ready just days before war broke out. Test pilot Eric Varsitz was eager to take off.
He started and then he disappeared. And after a while he came back and we thought, oh, he's landing. He didn't. He made another round and we said, oh my God, he must like it. But we didn't have the airplane very filled up with gasoline. He landed and stopped the airplane just where Heinkel stood. And he said everything functioned beautiful and the engine worked well, and he was really himself, very enthused. We had a nice festival.
A jubilant Heinkel rang General Ernst Udet at the German Air Ministry.
I learned later on he called Udet and he said, "Hey, congratulations, but let me sleep. That's an ungodly time."
Germany had flown a jet plane first, where Britain should have done, had it backed Frank Whittle sooner. Power jets had now moved to the Ladywood Works, a scruffy foundry at Lutterworth in Leicestershire. Today, there's nothing to show that history was once made here. But in these buildings, Britain slowly expanded its jet program.
In 1939, we only had just a handful of about half a dozen. And at the beginning of 1940, we began to build up a team, and I was very careful in picking real quality. You know, first class honours Cambridge, first class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science. We were advertising. Of course, we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Whittle's charm and enthusiasm at once inspired his new team to strive for the impossible. The noise and lack of space at Ladywood forced Whittle himself to work at Brownsover Hall, a country house nearby. Here he worked through the night, desperately aware that his work could shorten the war, and drove himself to nervous exhaustion.
My memory of him really was just somebody always working. And when he was at home, if he took any time off, say Sunday, he would sit in his chair by the fire at Broomfield, and we'd be there with his slide rule, which of course people used in those days to do their calculations, and bits of paper all over the place, working, and a little bit of time for myself and my brother, but not much, not much.
As Britain entered its most critical phase of the war, the expanding team at Ladywood was galvanized by a new order to prepare engines for a prototype jet fighter. Codenamed F-940, we know it as the Gloster Meteor. As a potential war winner, getting it in the sky to fight the Luftwaffe now became the focus of Powerjet's wartime efforts. Yet the Air Ministry still wouldn't fund Whittle properly, forcing him to work in impossible conditions.
In addition to our continuing financial problems, we had many others, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts.
I went to check in at the mess and asked what was going on. There seemed to be almost an air of conspiracy about the whole place, and nobody would give a straight answer to this.
We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials, and then on May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth.
That morning I went to the control tower to check if the weather was good enough for my en route flight to Croydon, but it obviously wasn't. And they said, would I mind doing a weather check for them? Anyway, I landed, and they said, would I be prepared to do a further weather test in the afternoon?
And then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again. And in the evening, Jerry Sayre did the flight.
An airplane was rolled out with a shape well, not so much the shape, but the construction of which I'd never seen before because it had no propeller. And an extraordinary whining noise came from it, and it taxied out to the end of the runway, and after a while eventually took off. And I was quite astonished to know what it was, because I'd never heard at this stage in my career of a jet aircraft.
The various government ministries refused to film this remarkable event. Luckily, an unknown photographer grabbed it in secret.
Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, and a party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. Then he held it down level and then climbed. One of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
And it landed successfully, and immediately it landed, it was absolutely inundated with people rushing out and congratulating the pilot. So I realized something quite extraordinary had taken place.
People in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover."
Well, everybody gravitated towards the officers' mess. And so I followed on, and there was quite a lot of hilarity going on in a corner of the room. I asked what it was all about, but still nobody would reveal what was involved. But it was quite obvious it was something quite momentous.
Britain's jet plane was better than anyone had realised. Faster than a Spitfire, it vindicated Whittle. Yet behind the scenes lay disappointment.
I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which is then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E.28 was just an experimental aeroplane.
Whittle's jet served notice on all piston engines, a notice that fast reached their manufacturers. They now demanded their share of a product none had invented, and which they'd rejected for years. Because of the war, Whittle would have to share his secrets with them.
All this, of course, is putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view, and that we had to swallow because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Whittle played a selfless, patriotic role in which he offered his knowledge freely to the British aviation companies. However, they were working flat out to build engines for planes like the Spitfire. So in 1941, Great Britain turned to the United States, still at peace, for backup in manufacturing its jet engine. The Americans had only been told about Whittle's power plant earlier that year. Ironically, their top scientist had dismissed the concept in 1940. They concluded the gas turbine engine could hardly be considered a feasible application to airplanes. The British government expected to keep the future rights in Whittle's invention and did not intend to give it away to a future competitor. But that's inevitably what happened.
We shipped over the engine in parts in the bomb bay of a Liberator, also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic.
For America, the jet story began the night of October 4th, 1941, with the arrival of a highly secret engine assembly in a Boston airport. It was Britain's now famous Whittle turbojet, the first jet engine successfully produced and flown by the Allies.
Gentlemen, I give you the Whittle engine. Consult all you wish and arrive at any decision you please, just as long as you accept a contract to build 15 of them.
They had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying.
Whittle himself visited the United States to advise with building the engines for this new plane. In the Great Republic, he was treated royally, and he in turn was astounded by what he found there.
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable. And their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
In America, doctors found that Whittle was by now battling with severe ill health. Back in Britain, the problems that caused it had only got worse.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There was no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside.
The Royal Air Force eagerly awaited the Meteor, but Powerjets was not allowed to produce the engines for it. That job had been contracted to a car maker, Rover.
Glosters were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do. The situation became so bad that it looked as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back.
Rover tried to redesign its engines and held up the Meteor by 2 years, but there was also dirty work.
We intended that the Rover company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the ministry and trying to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the ministry.
In 1942, the Meteor, Britain's first jet fighter, had almost been cancelled. Rover's problems with its engines only ended after Rolls-Royce took over. This again weakened Whittle.
Ernst Heinkel was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce. He was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development, because he had come to realize that this was the future of the aeroengine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aeroengine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance. And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the center of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us."
I asked my mother what he was doing. She used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush." I didn't become aware that he was anybody out of the ordinary until 1944 in January, when they made the whole thing public. And then the house became surrounded by reporters.
We had been working in complete secrecy until early January 1944, at which time, for reasons I don't really know, the British and American governments decided to make an announcement about it. It was like the world blew up around me, and the shock was very considerable.
Whittle and his engine dominated the front pages.
Says here in the Daily Herald, "I knew Frank had a secret," says his wife. So the cat is out of the bag. How strange it seems to be able to talk about it. It may mean that I shall be known throughout the world. In any case, my younger son Ian is a far brighter boy than I was at his age. I think he will be a success, the success of the family.
Had you seen that before?
No, I've never seen that before. Oh dear, how wrong.
As industry reaped the rewards of Whittle's genius, new jet fighters joined the Meteor. First off the drawing board was de Havilland's brilliant Vampire. The pilots loved their new equipment, although the planes remained highly secret, as Eric Brown discovered when he came to fly them.
When I was allotted to the jet flight at Farnborough, of course it was a top secret flight, and it was in a hangar at the far side of the airfield, well away from the main activity, and there were RAF regiment guards there with guard dogs, so it was very highly guarded at the time.
Once inside, the plane was a revelation to Brown.
We're getting into the cockpit of a jet aeroplane for the first time. You are struck by the wonderful view, because in a tricycle undercarriage, no propeller or large engine ahead of you, it is quite remarkable. And once you start up the engine, although to listen to a jet, if you're outside the cockpit, it sounds thunderous. When you're in the cockpit, it is incredibly quiet.
In July 1944, the Meteor became the first jet fighter to enter operational service. Around the same time, Allied pilots were startled to find themselves being intercepted by a German plane that had no propeller. This was the Messerschmitt 262. Germany's own jet program had by now graduated to this sophisticated model. Back in Britain, Frank Whittle seemed at his peak. He was a national hero, and power jets now had a factory with a skilled nucleus for the manufacturing of jets, always a goal of Whittle's. He had a clear vision for his company and himself.
No one except power jets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And I felt that the government having put in $2 million, that all the companies should be nationalised, forming a collective turbojet establishment. And, of course, I hoped that power jets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
Whittle put the idea to the Minister for Aircraft Production, Stafford Cripps. He only nationalised power jets. The state paid a paltry sum with nothing for Whittle himself, and acquired some outstanding work in progress.
At the time power jets was nationalised, we had some quite advanced projects going on. There was the LR1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. There was the engine for the Miles M52, the supersonic aeroplane. Those were our two big projects which we had in hand.
Britain's aeroengine companies then demanded that power jets be prevented from making engines in competition with them.
So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. Sorry.
Whittle felt compelled to resign from power jets. Just when horizons for jet travel were expanding, Britain lost him, and more.
The position in between 1945 and 1950 was that Britain was really ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development, but stupidly we allowed the lead to slip away.
The course of events was felt particularly in the Whittle household.
I think my mother was most distressed by what was happening to father. She was most distressed. I could remember her crying about it at times, because she would tell me, "Oh, Daddy's so unwell because of what's happening, and it is such a shame, and how can they treat him like this? Yes, it's very sad for her. He's managed to soldier on in the RAF. He was an Air Commodore in 1946, but in the end, by 1948, he'd been declared as unfit for flying, and somehow that was the last straw, and he and the RAF both agreed that he should retire, and he did.
Must have been very sad for him.
Oh, very sad, yes. The Air Force was everything to him.
The public knew none of this and saw a war hero receiving his just rewards. In 1948, Whittle went to Buckingham Palace to collect a knighthood. He also had a financial award for his invention, which was good for the time. Worth nearly £3 million today, it would soon become clear he was greatly under-rewarded. He sought a role, but his stature made him hard to place in an industry he himself had founded. No engine maker hired his services.
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up, and it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health.
Britain stole a march on the rest of the world when it launched the first jet airliner. The beautiful new plane, with its 4 engines, was a fruition of all Frank Whittle's early visions.
First, after he left the RAF, he turned his mind to the introduction of the Comet, and he joined BOAC as a consultant to help them introduce the Comet into service. He was very worried at the time that the thing was being rushed into service. I've got his 1949 diary where he discusses the strength of the square windows, and he was worried about that at the time, and was making a suggestion to de Havilland's on how they could get over the problem.
Whittle's advice was ignored. The Comet crashes which followed were caused in part by its square windows. With time on his hands, Whittle travelled and tried to recover his health. He also turned to writing his memoirs. The jet age took off without him, and, after the Comet accidents, largely without British planes. It was the Boeing 707 which brought long-range jet travel to the masses. After the 1950s, airlines were mostly buying aircraft from America. Whittle himself never worked on jet engines again, and memories began to fade of how the story had begun.
I think in this country they were beginning to forget all about Frank Whittle by the 60s and 70s.
It was all so different in the United States.
They were so much more gung-ho. They were very good at slapping him on the back and telling him what a good chap he was.
In 1976, Whittle went to live in America.
I think he felt more recognised over in the States than he did over here.
Eventually, Britain rediscovered its genius of the jet.
By 1986, even the Queen took a hand and awarded him the Order of Merit, and other honours came along following that. So I would say from about the early 80s onwards, people began to remember who it was who was the prime pioneer of the turbojet.
And also a man with a profound legacy. Today, we make almost 1.5 billion air passenger journeys a year, cheaply and safely, thanks to Frank Whittle. He shrank the world, but his gift to Britain is less appreciated. Its famous plane makers have departed, and today, Rolls-Royce leads the world in building jet engines.
I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things, you see, I never foresaw when I was working on this thing, is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain. in Cathay Pacific.
Kai Tak aerodrome at Hong Kong had a very interesting approach, a curved right-hand turn right down to almost a touchdown. And when Father came with me in the back of in the cockpit in a Boeing 747, he was very startled when he saw that his son was flying an airplane at 1,000 feet straight towards the foothills and then making a steep final turn, which of course was quite normal at Kai Tak. It was the way you had to do it. I hadn't briefed him, unfortunately, so he was very white-knuckled by the time we landed.
Sir Frank Whittle died in August 1996, assured of his position as the greatest aero engineer of the 20th century.
He was cremated in the USA, and the air attaché there brought his ashes over to this country, and I went to Heathrow to meet the aeroplane, and I came home and put the ashes on the bookshelf in my study with the ashes of my mother, who died 3 weeks earlier. I decided to put them in at the church of Cranwell, and they organised a meteor and a vampire. So we flew the ashes up to Cranwell, and they were interred there with a little ceremony.
In April 1937, Air Commodore Sir Frank Whittle's first gas turbine aero engine was given its initial trials. This engine was designed and built with the assistance of the BTH company. The firm of Power Jets Limited had been formed to proceed with its development. After working under Whittle's direction at a small factory near Rugby, the firm moved in 1943 to a new factory near Leicester, built for them by the government. Here, rapid progress was made in the development and manufacture. This is a model of the W2-700 engine, which, although weighing only slightly more than the original flight engine, developed 3 times the power. The way in which the Whittle jet engine works is simple. Air is drawn into the engine by a centrifugal compressor. Although similar to the compressor of an ordinary aero engine supercharger, it is much larger, handling more than 10 times the amount of air. After being compressed, the air passes to the combustion chambers, where it is heated by a spray of burning paraffin or petrol. The heated air and products of combustion then pass straight to the turbine, which is driven round at speeds up to nearly 20,000 revolutions per minute. The turbine in turn drives the compressor, to which it is directly coupled. A large part of the energy in the heated air is absorbed by the turbine, to enable it to drive the compressor and fuel pump. The remaining energy is used directly in the jet to drive the plane forward. In May 1941, the first flight of a British jet-propelled aeroplane took place. Built by the Gloster Aircraft Company and powered by a Whittle engine, the E.28 was purely an experimental plane. With this plane, much useful flying experience was obtained. The absence of noise and vibration in the cockpit, coupled with the simplicity of the controls, greatly impressed the pilots. The E.28 can now be seen in the Science Museum, South Kensington. Here is the prototype of the RAF's first jet fighter, the Gloster Meteor. The early Meteors were powered by Rolls-Royce Welland engines. These were a development of the Whittle W2B engine. The first RAF squadron to be equipped with Meteors was number 616. After carrying out their initial training at Farnborough, they transferred to Manston Aerodrome, Kent, in the summer of 1944. While at Manston, they went into action against the flying bombs and were found to be the most successful of our fighters, shooting down the greatest number of bombs per flying hour. Four years later, the first British aircraft constructors' show to be held at Farnborough took place in September 1948. Although piston engines were still in evidence, jets were very much to the fore. Next to the standard Meteor stood the first Meteor trainer, recently returned from a successful tour of Europe. In it, Gloster's chief test pilot, Bill Waterton, had given several continental countries their first experience of a jet plane's speed and grace. Close by stood the de Havilland Ghost engine Vampire, the first jet plane to hold the world's altitude record. The first single-engine jet fighter specially designed for the Navy. Powered by a Neen, its short twin jet pipes allow extra space for fuel tanks and thus give it increased range. The first jet-driven all-wing aircraft, the AW-52. The first four-jet airliner, the Neen engine Tudor 8, 2 days after making its maiden flight. And the world's first jet airliner, the experimental Neen Viking. And here comes the first jet flying boat, piloted by Geoffrey Tyson. The Saunders Row naval fighter doesn't seem to mind which way up it flies. Its two Metropolitan Vickers axial flow turbines give it great speed and maneuverability. Next, the Meteor Mark IV takes off. Here comes the Vampire. Some expert aerobatics by John Derry. Next, the Hawker naval fighter. The Meteor trainer. the AW-52. And so to the future. Jet-propelled airliners will fly fast and at great heights. The world will grow smaller.
I guess as a young physicist, I had no inhibition of thinking anything I wanted. And I flew with the commercial airplane, I believe it was a 3-engine Yonkers, and it was so unbelievable noisy and vibratory that I had the feeling it's a very unfortunate combination, the piston propeller with the airplane, all the dreamed elegance and smoothness of flying seemed to be driven out.
Did you at that time know anything about compression ratios and turbines and operating temperatures?
No. I thought what is required is an aerodynamic flow of gas to drive in a steady fashion the airplane. And much later, when I began to make calculations, I became aware of necessary pressure ratios and these relationships. But about turbines and compressors, I did hardly know anything at that time.
And had you known, would it have inhibited you? Would it have stopped you going on?
It would have perhaps brought me right away to the gas turbine. At the beginning, I didn't know that a gas turbine would be the right thing. And I didn't know anything about gas turbines, as good as nothing. As a matter of fact, I wasn't even sure what this process should be. It was rather nebulous. But pretty soon, when I started to think more strongly about this idea, I became aware of many possibilities, and my education in physics and in thermodynamics. I had a minor under Prandtl in aero and thermodynamics. And so I began to think along the lines how to produce a steady flow with a good efficiency. And slowly it came that my mind became clear that pressure ratios and temperatures and velocity ratios are very major factors.
And this, as you describe it, this is evolutionary, really, isn't it? You didn't have a streak of inspiration so much as an evolution of your thinking, right?
Not really. I hate to tell you what gave me the push in the direction, because it is really a more layman's approach. I walked around in Göttingen on the city walls and saw that strong chimney blowing, and that gave me the idea suddenly, you know, the gravitation gives you a certain pressure, and the hot air is not so much under the gravitational influence, and so the chimney is a kind of a thermodynamic process. Now, as a physicist, you know then that it's a very relative thing whether you have gravitation or inertia. So when you had a U-tube rotating and would take one leg of that U-tube and heat it, heat the gas in that other leg, then you have really a strong gravitational field, and therefore a very strong flow of hot gas in a rather small embodiment. And that was the reinvention of what the physicist Ernst invented already in 1912, which I learned much later. That was the so-called Nernst, N-E-R-S-T, Nernst turbine. And but before I knew that, I already departed from it, because I thought it is not possible to have a combustor rotating with high speed.
Did you, in the first place, did you start off from theoretical principles, or did you just go and make something?
No, I went to the theory of how can you produce flows. As a theoretical, in theoretical physics, you learn, for example, that when you have very small particles which are heated on one side and cold on the other, they produce an enormous thrust if the particles are smaller than or in the same order magnitude of the mean free path. And you know, we had in any window or show window usually that little mill which rotates when heat is radiated on it, because the black side gets hot and the non-black side stays cold, and that is then rotating very fast. Now that principle I learned very quickly is impossible to utilize because the mean free path is too small. And so I came to other ideas, and finally it brought me to the thing with the chimney and with the rotating machine, the Nernst turbine. And from the Nernst turbine, I noticed you cannot have a rotating combustor in high speed. So I cut it off and had a compressor wheel and a radial inflow turbine.
You wanted something, in other words, you knew that you wanted something that would flow.
Yes, yes.
That
was now a thermodynamic machine.
Can you tell me how you came across Max Hahn?
Oh, I had a little car, an Opel open sports car. And I went always as a student over the weekend into the snow mountains of the Harz, which is about 50 kilometers away from Göttingen. And Hahn was a machinist in the garage where I had my car. He came and talked to me sometime and said, "How come that you always come home without any scratch, and most people, when they come home, have here and there made an accident and so on. Well, I was pretty good in car driving in snow. And as a man, we talked then often about two-cycle engines, and he knew very well, he made the impression to me that he was greatly interested in engineering aspects, but he was only the head machinist. So when I had the idea of the first gas turbine type, I thought I have to make a patent and I have to make a model and to prove that it works in order to sell the idea. And I thought suddenly of Max Hahn, that he would be the only one I know who would probably be capable to build it. And so I came together with Max Hahn.
What were his gifts?
Well, he knew, from my standpoint, enormously much in machine working. He had a good knowledge in materials and in processes. So he was more or less a kind of a machinist with an obvious gift for engineering.
What type of engine did you make at Bartels and Becker?
It certainly was not supposed to be a prototype engine. That would have been too ambitious. But a model, I thought, which would show that the principle is working, that the combustor works, that the machine runs self-supportive, and you need only a small horsepower to start it, and then it runs by itself.
And this is what Max Hahn made, presumably, out of materials which you supplied, was it?
Yes, we bought it. Max Hahn and I, we thought the turbine side, we need heat-resistant material. And we could find in catalogs sheet metals, which we could buy, which I could buy, and we had on the turbine side sheet metal, which was heat resistance, on the pressure side normal construction steel.
This was, from your point of view, you were a physics student working on a PhD thesis, which strikes me as rather abstract, but in fact you did something tremendously practical, didn't you? Was this because of your temperament?
No, I do believe when I went into the engineering side, I always wanted something extremely simple. When my Professor Pohl asked me before the doctor thesis to make a simple apparatus demonstrating refractory materials, I came up with such a simple device that he was very enthusiastic and took it right away let it be built and took it into his physics model arsenal.
Now, I think when your demonstrator actually fired, Max Hahn said something rather amusing about it, didn't he?
Yes. Max Hahn, in his heart, did not believe that the machine would run. Now, when we had the machine driven by the little starter motor, and I saw that the burner didn't work because all the flames leaked out as yellow flames, which told me right away that the burners didn't work. And I was disappointed. Max Hahn however, was, to my greatest amazement, not at all disappointed. He said, my God, the starter motor lost a lot of power. In other words, the machine almost wanted to run. And also he said, and look, the flames came out with high speed at the proper side, namely at the turbine side, and not on both sides, what he probably thought on the compressor. So I felt that was amusing and showed me that a pessimist like Hahn was more elated than I was with the results of the first tests.
Essentially, was it an evolutionary idea or a flash of insight?
Honestly, I would think it's a combination of both. Because the goal was already there. I wanted to invent something which drives an airplane. Then I was looking for various processes which could do that, and most of them I rejected. And then the idea with the reinvention of the Nernst turbine was triggered by seeing that chimney. It was triggered, it wasn't really, so it was then very quick going into the Nernst turbine. And from the Nernst turbine, the logic told me you cannot rotate a burner so fast in one leg. You cannot produce the combustion properly. So you have to cut the machine off and put the burner still standing. That gave me the idea you have to have little ramjets, so to speak, as burners in the housing. So it is a combination of revolutionary, or I should say immediate thoughts, non-evolutionary thoughts, and evolutionary thoughts.
Were you pursuing the goal of high speed, particularly at that time?
I thought more this. The high speed was not the primary goal. To me, the smoothness and low noise was more the starting point of my thinking. But as I thought about it, I noticed that, as a matter of fact, it will be capable of driving the airplane faster. And because I thought the weight would be very light and the power output would be very large. And so I more and more drifted over in an evolutionary fashion, particularly when the Heinkel people told me that their only goal was higher speed, and they could care less about the smoothness and absence of vibrations, which was my original thought. So it's very hard. It grew into the direction, but it was not the starting point.
What did Professor Pohl say to you that struck you as particularly timely or appropriate?
He said, you are doing the right thing using physics to create new technology. That's what I like. I dislike, however, when they use it to make out of technology a science with lots of equations and lots of investigations not leading to any new thing.
How come that you came to go to Ernst Heinkel?
Well, I studied a third semester, I believe it was, or fourth semester, in Rostock. And I loved the Baltic Sea coast very much. I learned about Heinkel as a man who was for swift airplanes and very unconventional guy. And later on I put the two things together. The unconventional airplane man and the beauty of the Baltic Sea, I sure would think that would be a nice place to work. And so I choose Heinkel. Additionally, I felt I was afraid to go to engine companies. I thought they were too much ingrained in their recip engines, and my model didn't work sufficiently good. In fact, it didn't work at all. And so I thought Heinkel would be the right place.
I think that, in fact, what happened was that Professor Pohl put you in touch with Heinkel, didn't he?
When Pohl saw my predicament, he wanted to help me, and he said, I write a very nice recommendation letter because your ideas which I had read and your mathematical derivations are all right, but you need industrial support. You cannot privately finance combustion, which I agreed very strongly. And then he said, you know, the best thing is I will write the letter of recommendation and bring you together rather than you, because when I do it with my reputation, I can help you very much, which he did.
You went to see Ernst Heinkel. Was he alone the first time or in company?
He was alone in his villa in Warnemünde. He asked me questions, what one could do with it. He explained to me that he wanted to finance the whole thing by himself if it works. He said then, which reminded me almost on a circus manager speaking about his artists who jump the ropes and so on. He said, I have the best aerodynamicists, I have the best and best designers, and I want you to tomorrow to speak with them and explain your ideas. So with that, we parted. Next day I came to was confronted with his engineers. He was not present. And I got acquainted with the very famous two brothers Günthers, with a man, Dr. Mattes, from the experimental area, with an excellent aerodynamicist, Helmbold, who came later on here to the United States, and others, and Schwerzler. Yeah, Schwerzler was the designer. And in order to make the story short, after I explained and after I showed what my performance predictions theoretically were, the verdict was as follows. Siegfried Günther and Walter Günther, both, they enjoyed the fact that we don't have a propeller. They want, however, that the engine should be in diameter much per horsepower, should be very small in order to compete with the current great improved recip engines. The Schwerzler, who was the designer, said, oh, when that engine would ever work, it would be so much cheaper and lighter and simpler. That would be wonderful. And Dr. Mattes from the experimental section said he knows a little bit about turbine, and he came to values of that turbine which were not as favorable as mine, but still well enough to be of value for future aircraft potentialities, which made me very happy. But I did not get around why actually he came to these less good values. I learned much later, and not even from him, that my component efficiencies, which I had assumed were far too optimistic. Helmholtz later on discussed that with me about a month or so later.
Can I put this to you tactfully? How old were you then? You were very young. Didn't they treat you skeptically?
Yes, they did. I was then, I believe, just 24. When I started out, I was about 21 and shortly before 22. And in the stage I met Heinkel, I was 24.
And to be treated skeptically?
Yes, but Heinkel did not treat me skeptically, because that Professor Pohl's letter must have made an enormous impression, because I actually had succeeded with other things.
What kind of man was Heinkel to work with?
Well, Heinkel wanted things very fast. He was very optimistic, very positive, but a little bit unreal and unrealistic in his time schedules. He wanted things too fast.
What were the circumstances in which you were employed by Heinkel, first of all?
Heinkel offered me a preliminary contract where he would pay my expenses, which I had to income tax pay myself, not as an employee of the company. And as soon as success shows, then he wanted to give me what I wanted to have, a royalty contract and an employment contract. And that was the situation.
And Max Hahn was to come with you?
I wanted to have Max Hahn and got difficulties later on with the employment office. They said, you cannot do that. That man has a good position at Bartels and Becker and Göttingen, and God knows what comes out of your whole project. And I talked with Heinkel, and Heinkel said, they're crazy. Naturally, he comes. Because even when the project doesn't work and work out positive, I can always have a very good mechanic, and I like that he's coming to us too, and that settled the case.
In fact, of course, you are now really moored in circumstances of great secrecy, weren't you?
Yes, the secrecy was that he didn't want that we talk to anyone, even to the Air Ministry. So it was a secret except for him. It was against the his own factory, the Air Ministry, and against anything else except him. And so he wanted that we have a location apart from the whole company.
This was really to protect you, was it?
Well, I think, I'm not sure whether it was to protect me. It could be, but I think his main objective was that he didn't want that the Air Ministry hears about it. At that time, I didn't know it. At that time, I thought that was a very idealistic view. Much later, I found out that the Air Ministry would have stopped him right away.
Why so?
Because he was an airplane company, and Germany had already too many engine corporations. They had the Bramo, they had the BMW, they had the Daimler-Benz, they had the Junkers. That means 4 major companies, and the Air Ministry was trying to cut one already, namely Bramo.
Yes, can you tell me how much the original model cost you to make?
The model itself, without the burners, was about 500 marks at that time. And I owe thanks to Max Hahn, who had, through helping in the design, simplified it to the point that it could be
done with his machines and in that short time. The burners, the little stationary ramjet burners, were about also $500-600, so a little bit more expensive, because I had a very difficult ignition system with spark, not with spark plugs, with a hot platinum wire and a little hydrogen flame, which was supposed then to ignite in turn the mass of fuel.
Every aircraft has a story that deserves to be told. Don't let these legends fade into the past. Like this video and subscribe to our channel and help us keep aviation history alive.
I was quite astonished to know what it was because it had no propeller.
And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." There was the awful race against time. There was the skullduggery.
She used to say, "Oh, well, Daddy's doing something very hush-hush."
I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
A small English church is the last resting place of a man who didn't just change the face of the earth. He enabled us to see what it actually looked like. His name was Frank Whittle. This is the story of how he invented the jet engine. He overcame all the odds, only to see the British government almost throw his idea away and miss a chance to shorten the Second World War.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was a foreman in machine tool manufacturers. And I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went for an elementary school there. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that. I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War, and I just wanted to fly.
The teenage Whittle therefore applied to join the Royal Air Force as an apprentice, only to be rejected. He was too small.
I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow and a series of exercises, Max Alding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. So I thought, well, I'd go through the whole process again as though I'd never happened, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time, and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing.
Whittle didn't enjoy life as an RAF apprentice. In that rank, he would never get to fly. What brightened Whittle's life was the Model Aircraft Society, where he excelled at building working replicas. His talent for this singled him out to the authorities. But there was in fact another reason